Admiral Zexton clicked his mandibles in amusement as he reviewed the intelligence reports flooding his command console. The newest species to stumble into galactic society called themselves humans, and they were everything the hegemony had expected from a primitive world, soft-bodied, short-lived, and laughably weak. "Look at these readings," he chittered to his aide, his forearms gesturing at the holographic displays. "Their bone density is pathetic. Their muscle fibers are inefficient. They require constant atmospheric pressure just to survive, and they die if their core temperature fluctuates by mere degrees." The aide, a scaled Vorthak warrior, nodded agreement. "The Conquest Fleet reports they bruise from impacts that wouldn't even register on our armor. Some of them weep, actually leak fluids from their optical organs, when experiencing minor psychological stress." Zexthon's compound eyes glittered with predatory satisfaction. The hegemony had crushed 17 civilizations in the past millennium, each one adding to their vast empire of subjugated worlds. These humans would be no different, perhaps easier than most. The first human delegation arrived 3 cycles later aboard a vessel so primitive it still relied on chemical propulsion. Ambassador Sarah Chen stepped onto the hegemony flagship with 5 companions, all of them looking impossibly small and vulnerable, surrounded by the towering forms of their hosts. "We come seeking peaceful coexistence," Chen announced in carefully practiced galactic standard, her words barely audible through the translator matrix. Zexton didn't bother to hide his contempt. "Your species is fragile, human, weak. You have nothing we desire except your compliance. Submit now and your deaths will be swift." What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones across the galaxy for generations to come. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, something cold and calculating that made even Zexton's battle-hardened warriors unconsciously step back. "Fragile," she repeated softly. "Admiral, I think you misunderstand what that word means. The human delegation was imprisoned, of course, standard protocol, but within hours, impossible reports began flooding in from across the hegemony's territory. Human ships, hundreds of them, had somehow appeared simultaneously in 17 different star systems, not warships according to the sensor readings. These vessels bore the markings of merchants, explorers, even what appeared to be civilian transports. "How did they achieve such coordination?" Zexthon demanded of his intelligence officers. "Their communication technology is centuries behind ours." The answer came not from his staff, but from Ambassador Chen's voice, somehow broadcasting throughout the flagship despite her imprisonment in a supposedly impenetrable detention cell. "You called us fragile because we break easily," her voice echoed through the corridors. "But you never asked what happens when something breaks. On 17 worlds, the merchant ships began their work. What the hegemony had dismissed as primitive, cargo vessels revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous. Generational ships packed with humans who had spent decades, sometimes centuries, traveling through space in suspended animation. These weren't warriors in any sense the hegemony understood. They were farmers and engineers, teachers and artists, families with children who had been born between the stars. But they shared one trait that the galaxy's apex predators had failed to comprehend. They were the survivors of a species that had clawed its way up from a death world where everything tried to kill them. The humans didn't fight the hegemony's forces directly. Instead, they did something far more terrifying. They began to adapt. On Xerion Prime, human refugees seeking shelter introduced microscopic organisms that began converting the planet's methane atmosphere into something breathable for carbon-based life. Within days, the native population found their breathing apparatus failing as their world's air composition shifted. On the mining world of Krell 9, human scientists offered to help improve efficiency in the quantum extraction facilities. The grateful overseers never realized that the humans were actually mapping every critical system, every power relay, every structural weakness in the planet's industrial infrastructure. In the hegemony's core systems, human entertainers began telling stories, simple tales of their homeworld shared in marketplaces and cantinas. Stories of creatures called honey badgers that fought animals 50 times their size, of organisms called tardigrades that could survive in the vacuum of space, of a species that had turned its planet's most dangerous predators into pets and livestock. Your mistake, Chen continued her broadcast, her words now reaching every corner of hegemony space, was thinking that fragile means weak. On Earth, we have a saying. It is not the strongest species that survives, but the most adaptable. The simultaneous strikes began exactly 72 hours after the human delegation's arrival. Not explosions or beam weapons, but something far more insidious. On Xerion Prime, the air itself turned toxic to the native population. On Krell 9, every piece of technology more complex than a lever simply stopped working, their quantum matrices somehow inverted. Across 17 worlds, critical infrastructure failed in cascading breakdowns that seemed almost organic in their spread. Zexthon watched his empire crumble in real time, and only then did he begin to understand. The humans hadn't brought weapons. They had brought themselves. And like some sort of adaptive virus, they had insinuated themselves into every weakness, every flaw, every critical dependency that held the hegemony together. You see, Admiral, Chen's voice continued, now carrying an edge of something that might have been pity. Humans are fragile. We break under pressure. We shatter when pushed too hard. But when glass shatters, the pieces are sharp enough to cut. As alarms wailed throughout the flagship and reports of total system failures cascaded in from across the galaxy, Zexthon finally comprehended the true horror of what his empire faced. They hadn't encountered a primitive species ripe for conquest. They had awakened something that had survived ice ages and supervolcano eruptions, something that had built civilization on a world where the weather could kill and the very air was poisonous to most galactic life forms. They had challenged a species that had learned to thrive by becoming the most adaptable, most persistent, most creatively destructive force their brutal homeworld could produce. The hegemony fell not to superior firepower or advanced technology, but to the universe's most dangerous predator, a fragile species that had learned to make its brittleness into a weapon. In the end, they never saw the humans coming, because they never stopped to consider what kind of creature calls a death. World home.